First on BBC1 Panorama with John Taylor.
The future shape of the British countryside is up for grabs. An area the size of Devon will soon be freed from under the plough, releasing millions of acres of land. Tonight, Panorama asks, will that land be free for us all to use, or will we end up paying farmers millions of pounds to leave it standing idle? What choice for the countryside? In Essex, a sign of things to come. Land that once grew food needed no more. It's been estimated that by the turn of the century, up to 5 million acres of farmland could go out of production. In 20 years' time, 1/5 of the total land area of Britain could become available for alternative uses.
There is tremendous opportunity here. You see, agriculture has been hogging the land surface, 80% of it, for many years. And we've now got this terrific opportunity because really of technological change, which has enabled us to grow food on a far smaller amount of land. And land could now be released from farming, and we could benefit both as taxpayers and as countryside users.
I think as a nation we have to say, well, what do we want to do with that land? What kind of countryside do we want for the future? What is the balance we want to see between agriculture, conservation, forestry, recreation, industrial development? I think as a nation we haven't thought that through, and we're going to have to think it through rather quickly if we're going to get the countryside we want in the 21st century and beyond.
The face of the British countryside is set to change. Ever since the war, we've used every available acre of land to produce food. Now, in an attempt to tackle Europe's surpluses, we're going to pay farmers not to grow food, leaving more than 1.5 million acres of farmland redundant. Whole swathes of the countryside could become derelict. And already the question's being asked, why can't this land be put to better use? And shouldn't we all be able to choose what happens to it? In East Anglia, James Rankin prepares autumn crops for sowing. Since 1983, he's built up this farm into a thriving business. But farmers like him have become victims of their own efficiency. From this winter, under a controversial new scheme called Set Aside, he'll have to stop growing food on 15% of his land. He'll be paid for doing it, and the taxpayer will foot the bill, paying out more than £1 billion a year for farmers not to grow food.
I've chosen this field here, this block here, which adds up to the right acreage.
We, the taxpayer, the consumer, we're going to pay more money for you to farm less land.
Exactly. You're going to do exactly that, and that is what you, the taxpayer, has decreed that I should do. I should now farm for subsidies.
And what kind of cheque are you going to get every year then? You work that out?
Well, when it's all said and done, I'll be receiving a cheque for nearly £25,000 a year. And you might well ask me what you're getting for that.
Well, what am I getting for it?
Well, you're getting nothing more than if we had a free market and it costs you nothing.
And what about your neighbours? What kind of cheques will they get? They've obviously got bigger farms.
Yes, well, you just multiply it up. I mean, I'm 263 acres and I'm getting, 25,000. So if you go up, put another naught on it, if somebody who's got 2,500 acres will be getting, nearly £250,000.
I think people will be outraged at the amount of money that is just being thrown in a great big hole and not really achieving anything very much apart from retaining, subsidising the present incumbents of farmland in this countryside. I think they'll be outraged by that when they realise the amount of money that's being squandered in this way.
It may seem absurd to pay farmers not to grow food. But Set Aside is part of a package of reforms designed to reduce Europe's massive grain mountains, which last year cost £23 billion in subsidies. prices will be cut and land taken out of production. Europe is going to extraordinary lengths to make sure the reforms work. Here at the National Remote Sensing Centre in Farnborough, a satellite has been hired to snoop on farmers from 450 miles above the Earth. Almost every field can be checked to see that farmers don't grow food on set-aside land.
What we have on the screen is an image showing all the fields, some woodland and roads. It has some unusual colours because the way that the image how we actually view the image is we see it in different wave bands. Every object on the Earth reflects in different wavelengths, and we can take advantage of that by looking far into the spectrum, into the near infrared, picking out these differences and showing them as different colours.
So you can spot individual crops by different colours?
That's right. Every field will show, every crop will show as a different colour.
Critics say this high-tech policing will be expensive to implement and hides the fact that set-aside is just another way of continuing to subsidise farmers.
Are you really seriously suggesting that we're going to have some vast agricultural Gestapo stalking every acre and hectare of the entire European community, popping their heads over the hedgerows to see what farmers are up to? They're not reforms at all. They're a continuation of insanity by another means. It merely means that the community is determined not to tackle the issue of agricultural subsidies seriously.
Well, I don't see this reform as finishing here. It's the first step. We've at long last got reform of the Common Agricultural Policy. It's largely along the lines Britain wanted, but it doesn't go far enough. And I'm not here to defend where we are. I'm only saying we're a good step further towards where I want to be than we used to be.
The reforms may not be tackling subsidies directly, but ministers claim that set-aside will lead to lower prices in the shops. Subsidies have so far meant high food prices. Some foods are 3 times higher in Europe than the rest of the world. But most farmers loathe the whole idea of set-aside.
Because what happens, it can start growing out, can't it? Which, you know.
Tim Carson's family have been farmers for over 100 years, working the land here in the Vale of Pewsey in Wiltshire. Forcing farmers not to produce food goes against the grain, but set-aside is here, and the land has to be chosen.
But I'll give you a cue.
So you're going to have to take out, not even roughly, 150 acres of land?
Approximately about 150 acres, yes, right. Which I totally disagree with.
Is it difficult for you to decide which land to take out?
Well, it has been very difficult, really, yes.
Each farmer will be paid £85 for every acre of land that's set aside.
Well, over to our right here.
Tim Carson sees the compensation payments for the land he'll stop farming as a bribe not to do the job he's done all his life.
I just think it's criminal. You know, we're here to farm the land, and now we're being asked not to farm, 15% of it.
Will you make money out of it?
No, nothing will be made, but on the other hand, nothing will be lost. That's how they're going to be able to persuade us to do it.
What's your main problem with set-aside? Why are you against it?
Well, because, I'm a farmer. I'm here to farm the land. I'm not here to sort of sit watching weeds grow on it for half the year.
In essence, set-aside appears to be a scheme for paying farmers lots of money for doing nothing. And to the general public, that might appear a bizarre way of conducting business. How do you justify set-aside?
Well, if it meant paying farmers for doing nothing, I'd be wholly against that principle. But farmers have to look after the land. We need the land kept in reasonable shape for leisure purposes as well as for future agricultural purposes. So I want farmers to be paid to do something, to look after it properly.
The evidence from a previous set-aside scheme isn't encouraging. This field in Kent was taken out of production under a pilot project. Its air of dereliction hasn't gone unnoticed by those who live nearby.
Frequently. And I've had many people complain to me that they simply don't like this because these weeds which we have, ragwort and thistle, they're very dominant weeds.
The pilot scheme took only a tiny area out of production, but fields choked by weeds and thistles can still be seen all over Britain. The new set-aside is meant to be kinder to the countryside, but there's still considerable scepticism.
What I don't like about it is that it doesn't deliver any positive benefits. It's only negative benefits that it's delivering. And people hate seeing their countryside change and become ugly, untidy and uncared for.
What kind of countryside do you think people can look forward to under set-aside schemes, and particularly if they increase?
Well, you're going to see, you know, obviously nicely cropped fields, and then you'll suddenly see a field, I'd imagine, full of weeds for a while, and then it's going to be just a good mess, I reckon.
Just to demonstrate coming out of long-term set-aside.
An open day organised by the government for farmers to learn how to deal with set-aside. The government is determined that the new set-aside won't repeat the mistakes of the old, and extra measures have been introduced.
In this plot we've got perennial ryegrass, the variety is Mel.
Set-aside fields will have to be mown once a year to encourage wildlife and flowers. The use of pesticides banned. Set-aside of the future will have green credentials. But in a community that's proud of its traditions and ties with the land, it's difficult to find anybody with a good word to say about set-aside. As a financial package, farmers say they'll be no better off. And they can't see set-aside improving the look of the countryside. Instinct tells them it simply won't work.
Most farmers will feel it's against their nature. Basically, we're on business to manage land, to look after land, to grow crops and animals on that land, and it goes against our grain not to do anything on it.
We've always been taught to produce or farm our land to the best of our ability, and now we're being told that what we've got to do is grow thistles and docks and ragwort and think that it's a good thing.
What's the land going to look like?
It certainly won't be a conservation area. It'll be rubbish.
I don't like seeing agricultural land put out of production and being left derelict. I mean, I think that's bad for the countryside.
Where will the effects of set-aside be most visible? Crop growing is widespread in Britain, but it's heavily concentrated in the huge flatlands of Suffolk, Norfolk and Cambridgeshire, and in the East Midlands. But everyone will notice a change to the countryside. Set-aside will take out 1.5 million acres of land across the British Isles. On individual farms, it will be up to each farmer to choose which land he sets aside, and each year farmers will have to change the fields they set aside. Taking out parcels of land here and there will inevitably give the countryside a random, higgledy-piggledy appearance. Critics say if set-aside is really to benefit the countryside, it should have been given much clearer objectives.
If we really have to have set-aside, what that land should be doing is recreating the landscape features, the habitats, which we've lost so many of over the last few decades. It should be directed to the appropriate parts of the country. It should do specific environmental things. It shouldn't be about creating dereliction, weed-infested fields in the countryside. It shouldn't be about apparently paying farmers to do nothing.
Take two.
In the fictitious world of country folk, set-aside has become a hot topic. The basic idea is to cut food production, but down in Ambridge, Brian is already devising ways to make sure that set-aside won't reduce his production one bit, as he explains to daughter Debbie.
Well, presumably you'll be setting aside your worst land, you know, badly drained banky bits that don't yield so well.
Yeah, but so will everyone else.
And putting a bit of extra fertiliser on the rest?
Well, perhaps not extra fertiliser, but I'll certainly be looking at pest and weed control.
So, 15% less land won't necessarily mean 15% less produce?
No.
Well, doesn't that rather defeat the object of the exercise?
It's not my problem.
It seems that the Archer's scriptwriters have done their homework. In the real world, farmers are looking for loopholes to exploit. According to this retired farmer, they'll find any way to keep production up.
Well, if they've got the option, obviously they'll choose their poorest yielding land and keep their best land for growing the best crops.
And what incentives will there be to look at land and say, well, I've not grown on that before, but I'll try and put it into set-aside?
Oh, very much so. I mean, you'll bring in every possible acre
to get the set-aside payments. And in fact, a lot of farmers will even go outside their own farms and buy or rent poor quality land, which they will put into set-aside to meet their 15% requirement, leaving their good land going on quite sensibly, producing sensible economic yields of grain.
But set-aside's supposed to reduce production.
Well, I will give you any odds you like to mention that there will be no reduction in European corn production over the next 5 years, cereal production, as a result of set-aside. None whatsoever.
If set-aside must be used for political reasons, then design it to provide significant public benefits in the form of...
In America, they've had set-aside for 50 years. But production has continued to rise. At this symposium in Cambridge, David Irvin, a former chief advisor to the United States Department of Agriculture, delivered a warning for Britain.
I think a principal danger is that set-aside, once instituted, seems to last for a long time. At least it has in the United States. Well, and there are very good reasons for that. People find that once set-aside occurs, that it's an easy way to make money, perhaps, and therefore it's not as easy to get rid of it. And it might be useful to think about ways to give a fixed life to set-aside in the European community so that it doesn't go on and on and on forever.
Will set-aside still be here in the year 2000?
Well, I always believe that the worst politicians are those who try to look in crystal balls. I merely say that there never has been a long period of surplus which is not followed by a long period of shortage, and therefore I believe that we will have periods of shortage, and we have to prepare for that.
But author and countryside campaigner Marion Shord believes that setting aside farmland in case we need it for food production in the future just keeps inefficient farmers in business and blocks any alternative use of the land.
Why should agriculture be treated any different from other industries? I mean, you could say it's a strategic industry. It's important that we should be able to feed ourselves if ever the need arose. And that's certainly true, but you don't have to keep a whole lot of farmers out there in the countryside just in case that should happen, when there are all sorts of other better things that could be done with our countryside.
Given that we don't need the food that many farmers are producing, what's the point of paying them all to stay on the land? Why not cut subsidies altogether and, to put it harshly, let some of them go out of business so that their land could be released for other uses? This would not only save the taxpayer a lot of money, but it would also, it's argued, give the public a choice in what should happen to it.
My old man's a golfer, he wears a golfing cap. He goes around with one glove on, he's a funny looking chap.
Di Bassett, the singing farmer, used to graze prize-winning cattle on his land, but now he's found a better way of making a living.
He looks like Rupert Bear.
Di's new business is golf.
Good shot, well done. It's nice and straight. Down to the 100-yard mark, look.
He's just opened a driving range on his farm near Bridgend in South Wales. Di's convinced that swapping farmland for fairways is a much better way of doing business. But isn't he worried that this new activity will spoil the look of the countryside?
I think we've done it in a way which complements the environment and doesn't detract from it. All we've done is mow the grass instead of graze it. We've got the range building, of course, which is, I think, a lot more attractive than a lot of farm buildings, certainly than some of our own farm buildings. And now that it is up, we intend to keep it that way and enhance the countryside rather than detract from the beauty of it.
Any plans to expand?
We'd like to expand. We haven't approached our planning friends yet regarding the possibility of maybe a pitch and putt course and the rest. We don't know. We want to concentrate on the golf range, keep it nice, keep people happy and keep them coming back.
Di Bassett looks set to make much more money out of golf than he ever did out of farming. And the signs are that many farmers are now taking the same route. Farmers are branching out into all kinds of other businesses. Just down the road from Di Bassett's golf range, a go-kart track on land that used to be farmed. It's clear that without subsidies, many more farmers would choose to use the countryside in any way they can.
I've got the family to support, and I've got my brother and myself taking a living out of the farm. And as costs are rising, incomes are not rising to match up with them. And I don't really want to drop my standard of living any further than it is.
Have you got any plans to diversify more?
Well, we've got plans. We're diversifying into caravan business, which is on the same site here. And the more enterprises we can have, the better, I feel.
This prospect is enough to make many countryside lovers shudder, but some say it's exactly what's needed. If market forces go forward, I mean, you're going to get go-karting areas, you're going to get more caravan parks, you're going to get golf ranges.
Well, again, this is a very urban dweller's view. Those who look out from the cities look at the countryside and tend to assume that this is their private parkland where they can go for fun and festive joy and amusement on a holiday in a caravan on the cliff edge. With all due respect, people who live in the countryside have every right, just as much right, to earn their living as those who live in the towns. And what they want are jobs, and what they want is security.
They also want homes. This is Charlbury, a small country town in West Oxfordshire. Round here, a growing population is hungry for housing. Any surplus land could be snapped up. Peter Burchett has lived in Charlbury since the 1960s. He remembers when this land was farmland. Now, 65 new houses are being built here despite opposition from local people like him. Without set-aside, more land could be released, but there'd be further conflict.
Well, this development isn't even the thin edge of a wedge. It's one more wedge, and it'll go on and on. If this is a set a precedent, we'll have suburbia carried further and further up the hill, and that is what's worrying us here.
Critics of set-aside argue that if its subsidies were ended, some farmers would go out of business, and farmland could be released, not only for housing, but also for other uses in the countryside.
I think people are anxious about development in their backyard, and they see any kind of development as intrusive. They see development in the countryside as a reduction in the quality of life, whereas for many local people it's an improvement in their quality of life. They desperately need new housing, they desperately need new employment, desperately need new services. You won't get any of these things unless you allow the countryside and the people living and working in the countryside to grow and develop. You can't leave the countryside to basket weaving and blacksmiths.
But perhaps you could leave it to nature lovers. This is the Minsmere Reserve in Suffolk, a mecca for bird-watching enthusiasts. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds has recently bought 400 acres of farmland here next door to the reserve. The cost of the land was high, more than £300,000. If the government stopped subsidising farmers, the price of farmland would drop. Land would become affordable, allowing many other conservation groups and wildlife organisations to follow Minsmere's example and replace farmers as custodians of the countryside.
You see, tremendous number of people in this country are interested in wildlife, and yet the wildlife voluntary organisations, because of the high price of agricultural land, a high price that's sustained because of support to agriculture and because of all these new subsidies that are replacing money from farming to money for conservation, they are unable to buy very much land. And if the 2 million members of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds could buy swathes of countryside rather than just a few fields, as all they can afford to buy really at the moment, then you could devote a lot more land to wildlife.
But there are other parts of Britain where any talk of alternative uses of the land is simply academic. This is Swaledale in North Yorkshire. The landscape has been shaped entirely by hill farming. If farmers were to leave the land, there would be no other use for it. And there's already evidence of what the countryside would look like if market forces prevailed. Many dry stone walls like this one are already crumbling and falling into disrepair. Farmers simply can't afford to maintain them, and there's nobody else to do it. The great fear is that if this process continues, the very character of the landscape will change forever. For the past 30 years, Ronnie Foster has farmed in Rosedale on the North Yorkshire moors. His is a constant battle for survival against the elements and economic forces. Even with subsidies, hill farmers are in trouble. The only way Ronnie Foster can maintain his stone walls is through a scheme run by the North Yorkshire Moors National Park. Subsidies keep him in business, extra subsidies make sure he preserves the landscape.
The general public has, over the years, had the countryside provided for them on the back of the farmer for free. Those days, I'm afraid, are over, and if it is desirable to keep features in the countryside that are uneconomic, then finance must be found to do just that.
Why should we pay people like you to keep the land looking pretty? Why shouldn't we let market forces just let you go to the wall?
If the countryside you want is the countryside as a result of market forces, so be it. If you want something other than dereliction in the countryside, then the finance to provide it must be found.
How important is it, do you think, that we continue to subsidise the hillside farmer?
I think it's vital. I think, quite frankly, that if we ignore this problem, then I think we cannot expect to see the countryside maintained in these areas in its present form.
But we're going to have to pay for it then, aren't we?
We're going to have to pay for it.
Do you think people will want to pay for the countryside?
Oh, I think that we have something special here that the whole country appreciates. We know that we get many visitors who come to see nothing other than this beautiful countryside. And I think that the moment we tell them that that's in jeopardy, just as they wish to preserve the buildings that we have, they want to preserve the landscape.
Put up these various...
A survey of 15,000 visitors in the Dales, carried out by Professor Tim O'Riordan, found that people do indeed have strong views on the kind of countryside they want to see preserved.
People mostly wanted to have landscapes which were most like the current landscapes of the Dales. This one is what is called skeletal. In other words, it is similar to the Dales landscape, but a thinned out version. And this is a very, very intensive conserved landscape. This one got the number 1, this one got the number 2.
Professor O'Riordan argues that none of the landscapes for which the public expressed a strong preference would ever be possible if farming were left entirely to market forces.
They all involve money being spent to preserve it. They all involve direct, real intervention by the political system, and they involve planning in the total rather than planning farm by farm. These are very important considerations for these kinds of landscapes.
The weekly sheep market at Leyburn in the Yorkshire Dales. Hill farming used to be profitable, but many of the farmers who bring their sheep to be sold here now make less than £100 a week. Hill farming is a dying industry. Already, some farmers are leaving it altogether. If things go on as they are, many more are sure to follow. It's clear that without an increase in subsidies for this type of farming, some of the best-loved landscapes in Britain would disappear. How important to you are subsidies to keep you in business?
Well, they are the only thing keeping us in business at the moment. There's no doubt about that at all. A lot of us probably would rather do without the subsidies, but the fact is, without them, we wouldn't be farming.
What would happen to you?
We'd simply have to pack in. There's no other way for it.
And if farmers in large numbers in the uplands, in the hills, did pack in, what would happen to their farms and what would happen to the countryside that you see around it?
Well, there's only one thing that could happen, and they would be ranched. And you would see walls and fences, well, mostly walls we're talking about in Swelldale, going down. You'd see heather probably being overgrazed, you'd see bracken encroaching, and you would see lots of weeds and thistles and things like that.
Is it not worth preserving, as a special case, the hill farmers, say the ones that work?
What are we going to do? Pickle them in aspic as a dying species? No, I don't think you can preserve any form of activity which the market says it doesn't want. We're not preserving the jobs of miners. We're not preserving the jobs of Jaguar car makers. We're not preserving shipyard jobs, and we're not preserving steel jobs. And I don't think when urban dwellers come to seriously consider this argument, whether they want to preserve Farmer Jones in Swaledale.
Sutton Bank, a popular spot for viewing the Yorkshire Dales, if only through a car window. Even if the public did want to subsidise hill farmers as a special case, critics of the government argue that market forces should be the general rule. Other farmers may not be so deserving of subsidies. These are the prairie lands of Suffolk, the kind of countryside the public doesn't stop to admire. Farming here is intensive and high-tech. This is the home of the barley barons, and the land has made them rich. But in the process, they've made the countryside dull and featureless, and the public might think twice before it pays to preserve their way of life.
It may be that for social reasons or environmental reasons you actually want to keep certain farmers somewhere. Maybe you do want to retain hill farmers in certain areas for social reasons. And so you can subsidise that, and you can do that if you want to. But you don't just throw a whole lot of money at all farmers and just say, because you happen to be a dairy baron or a barley baron now, you are some unique rural asset that sustains rural communities and we've got to keep you there for all time. That's not the way to behave.
You can't get the food at the price which gives a decent return for the farmer unless you have some sort of subsidy. What I want to make sure is that that subsidy is directed to the farmer so that he can look after the land and so that the land is there for use for agriculture if we become short of food.
The government argues that agriculture is a strategic industry and far too important to be left to market forces alone. And as we've seen, it's prepared to provide across-the-board subsidies to the tune of millions of pounds. The government accepts public concern over the effects of intensive farming on the environment, but insists that farmers can be made good custodians by offering them further subsidies to put the countryside before profit. One such scheme has been operating here on the Sussex Downs. The Downs have been designated an environmentally sensitive area, ESA for short.
Commercial, it wasn't a commercial.
So it wasn't a very good farming prospect.
It wasn't a good farming.
Here, farmers like Harry Goring are paid to manage their land in less intensive ways. And as long as there's money to be made, farmers are happy to join up.
It's not actually me that's after it. It's the political masters and the general public and the councillors who have decided that the South Downs, they've decided really it wants to look like old-fashioned traditional grassland down, and that is round, green, scrubless and grazed, and that's the effect that we're trying to produce by the ESA system. I don't personally mind what it looks like. I mean, apart from, so it's not a mess.
Over the hill from Harry Goring, the farmer who owns this land prefers to plough it up rather than join the ESA. Some farmers simply aren't interested in preserving the countryside unless the government makes it worth their while. It's clear that the government's flagship green schemes will fail without much more money, but all the money's tied up with blanket subsidies to set aside.
Some farmers are very conservation-minded. Most farmers are basically looking at the bank balance at the end of the day. And if, when they look at the equation, they say I can make more money out of the ESA, then they'll put it into ESA. It's as simple as that.
What's your worry about the ESAs? Is it going to deliver the environmental benefits that you think are necessary?
I say they're cosmetic. An individual farmer wouldn't see it that way because obviously he's doing quite well out of it and it's good from that landscape point of view. But I think if you look at it nationally or even perhaps on a European level, it's very, very small. You compare, for example, the South Downs, the amount of land that's in the ESA with the amount of land that's out of the ESA, there's very little that's actually gone in, maybe 20% perhaps. So the rest of it is still being intensively farmed. That's why I say it's cosmetic.
The government claims spending on environmentally sensitive areas will rise to £65 million a year by 1995. But leaks from inside the Ministry of Agriculture suggest that money for special environmental programmes may fall victim to spending cuts.
We already know that set-aside is sucking the Treasury coffers dry. There is not going to be any money left to pay for environmental measures. The public is quite willing to pay farmers to look after the countryside if they can deliver. But when environmental groups like Friends of the Earth go to the public in a year or two's time and say, listen, I think we should pay farmers so much money for looking after the countryside, they will say, hang on a minute, we've been paying them millions of pounds for doing nothing through set-aside. Why should we give these people any more money? And the tap is going to be turned off and the environment is going to lose out because of set-aside.
Set-aside will leave thousands and thousands of acres of land derelict. With whole swathes of the countryside lying idle, the public will be faced with a choice. We could carry on spending millions on wholesale subsidies to farmers, and that may risk seeing the land that we love lose its character. Or we could decide that the countryside can be better served by letting the market take over. As set-aside takes root on the land, it will be an important choice for us all.